Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, The Fading of Consumers' Digital Optimism and What It Means for Marketers, which is presented as part of the 2019 Digital Society Index. I'm your moderator, Zoe Fernandez. Before I introduce our speaker and we get to the webinar content, I'd like to share some information about the dentsu Aegis network as well as some key housekeeping items for you to keep in mind. Please note that the audio for today's presentation will be streamed live through your computer speakers. Please ask questions throughout the webinar as we'd love to hear from you. To ask a question, please submit them by clicking on the Q&A icon on your screen, entering your question and hit send. If we don't get your question during the Q&A session, we will email your response in the coming days. The dentsu Aegis network is a global network of 24 entrepreneurial agencies purpose-built for the digital economy. Across the world, our 20,000 employees power growth for brands and transform businesses. Our mission is to innovate the ways brands are built, and in today's world, that means connecting with people and not just as consumers. We help clients win, keep and grow their best customers, and our clients include category leaders, disruptive challengers and innovative startups. The members of the dentsu Aegis network family are best-in-class agency partners that provide solutions for all parts of the customer journey. As a collaborative network, our agencies combine forces and expertise to tackle larger business challenges and deliver bespoke integrated solutions. To lead today's webinar, we are joined by Dirk Herbert, Chief Strategy Officer at dentsu Aegis Network US. And now over to you, Dirk.
Thank you so much, Zoe, and thank you for everybody who is joining this webcast. What I would like to talk about today is a readout from our Digital Society Index study that dentsu Aegis Network launched earlier this year. The results that came out of it and were quite eye-opening for us and sort of led us to the theme of this webcast, this notion of what marketers can do as digital optimism fades. We know that after 30 years after the birth of digital, the impact on people and society has been quite significant. We know that digital has been a source of change and growth. And impacted a lot of positive things in the world. At the same time, what our research started to indicate and uncover is that many people today believe that digital's impact on their life has been mixed. While there has been a lot of optimism up until now, people are becoming increasingly aware of the repercussions that digital and technology can have on our lives, and this is what this particular presentation is all about. Just to give you a little taste of what we will be talking about, on a global level, 6 out of 10 people believe that not enough is being done to ensure digital technologies benefit everyone in society. So that is sort of the beginning of a gap that we started to identify through our survey, and we will be digging into in more detail as we continue through the presentation. The Digital Society Index was a collaboration between dentsu Aegis Network and Oxford Economics. It was designed to measure how well countries are developing a digital economy that works for all. And there are 2 parts to this particular survey. One was a statistical and economic analysis where we looked at and measured a country's performance across 3 specific dimensions. Dynamism, which is the strength of the core digital sector, and included data points like the size and growth of the information and communications technology sector, spending on research and development, and the availability of top quality tech university and talent. The second pillar is inclusion, which relates to the access that people have to the benefits of the digital economy and how widespread it is. This really is about encompassing dimensions that include access to digital infrastructure, as well as the quality of tech and digital related education that helps people cope with the new and ever-changing world that we're living in. And the final pillar is the trust pillar. This is measuring the trust that people have in data and the optimism towards the future. That is really about indicators such as cybercrime readiness, data protection legislation, and the transparent use of data by businesses and governments, and the attitudes of consumers towards those kind of issues. All of those kind of analyses were then supplemented with a global survey that was executed across 24 different countries and ultimately included 43,000 respondents, so quite in depth. When we look at the top-line overview of the Digital Society Index, this is sort of an aggregate measure that helps us understand which are the most vibrant digital economies in what kind of countries, and again, what are the countries that seem to provide the best platform to have digital products and services create an economy and an environment that benefits the largest numbers of users. What you see here is obviously that the United States, which is what will be the focus for much of the presentation later on, is obviously in a leadership position, only being eclipsed at this point by Singapore. It is worthwhile mentioning, though, that then rather than just looking at the aggregate score, the relative performance across the three different dimensions of dynamism, inclusion, and trust can also provide telling insight. What we see, for example, in the U.S. is that the U.S. performs well on dynamism and inclusion, but underperforms on trust. And that is obviously in a year where there have been a number of well-publicized data breaches and damaging congressional testimony by both Google and Facebook, the latter in particular being embroiled in a lot of controversy around data and privacy and the appropriate use of data and the control or lack of control that consumers have over that data. The imbalance signals a wider trend, the sort of lack of trust, and can actually also be seen in other Western markets, such as France, Germany, UK, and Australia, all of whom find themselves in the bottom half of the sample when it comes to the trust factor. So trust really has turned out in this particular edition of the Digital Society Index as a key theme to pursue, and we will drill down into that a little bit later on. In contrast to the US, France, Germany, and the UK, when we look at China, it's interesting that China actually performs quite well on trust and inclusion and breadth of access, but is relatively underpowered in dynamism. And a similar thing holds true for the Nordics when we look at Denmark, Norway, and Finland, as well as Estonia, many of which ended up in the top 10 of our global Digital Society Index. These are countries as well that score very well on trust and inclusion, but also lag on dynamism. So as we look at these kind of factors, we start to understand how countries at a broader macro level potentially can take corrective action to help ensure that whatever digital economy is built is one that performs at the highest level and, again, starts to benefit the largest number of people. One of the things that we wanted to dig into, though, is not just sort of the macro level view, but we also wanted to recognize and acknowledge that the race to deliver greater capabilities around dynamism and trust and inclusion, it has not always taken into full account the fundamental of human needs. A lot of the conversation is about data and technology and infrastructure, and the human element oftentimes gets lost in that conversation. This is why, as part of this particular survey, we reimagined Maslow's hierarchy of needs for the digital age. Rather than talking about the idea of basic needs, psychological needs, and self-fulfillment needs related to the analog world, we translated that into the digital world and started talking about digital needs. We started to talk about basic digital needs, which is around access to digital and trust in data. We talked about psychological needs in the context of digital in terms of how digital either impacts, improves, or actually inhibits health and well-being and the quality of life that people are experiencing. We looked at how digital impacts self-fulfillment needs in terms of digital skill empowerment and utilization, and people having a sense that the new world of change is one that will provide economic opportunity for them, not just for others. And then a broader view of societal needs, that especially at a time where we see increased polarization, we wanted to have a look at how digital is impacting people's belief that digital could be a driver of good and growth for the society rather than polarization and conflict. So taking those kind of themes into account, we will read out some of the results in a moment. We do believe that taking a human-centric view of a digital economy not just an economic-centric or data or technology-centric view, is incredibly important, because taking a human-centric approach will help marketers build better and more relevant brands. It will open up more economic opportunity and drive better business, and ultimately support a broader, more tolerant and inclusive society. So this is, again, one of the key reasons why we've done the Digital Society Index, to understand current mindset and what we can do to shift in a way that starts to benefit all. We know that the transformation driven by the digital economy has had mixed results across the globe. While there has been a lot of optimism, we know that in many parts of the world, skills are not keeping pace with needs. 1 in 3 people globally can't remember the last time they participated in digital training or received any kind of support to up-level their skills. We also know that the pace of change is increasingly causing anxiety. In countries like China, India, and Brazil, more than 80% of people feel the pace of change is too fast. These are obviously the developing economies. I think when we look at the Western countries, a lot of us have gone through that culture shock already. But I think the notion of change is coming too fast is pervasive, but in those particular countries, it is particularly high. And there's sort of the recognition that the future is not necessarily evenly spread. Only 1 in 2 people currently believe across the globe that digital technology will create new career opportunities for them. So obviously a huge opportunity for brands, for marketers, and governments to step in and build greater confidence that the new world that we're building will be one that everybody can participate in and can find opportunity in. We also found that human needs in this digital age are not consistently met. We know that there's been a decreasing trust in data usage, which means that only 49% of people globally believe their basic needs are being met when it comes to digital capabilities. When it comes to psychological needs, even with the emergence of technology that is meant to enhance health and well-being, only 38% of people globally believe that that need is being met, which means that the majority of people, almost 2/3, feel that digital products and services in the end tend to have a more negative impact on their health and well-being rather than the other way around. Only 45% of people currently feel that they have the right digital education or skill set, pulling into question whether, the self-fulfillment needs of a large percentage of the population are being met. And when it comes to societal needs, less than half of people globally believe that digital technologies will be a force for positive social change. And again, when we look at the increasing polarization that we've seen being driven by social media and some of the other sort of repercussions that have come from technologies that were meant to bring us together, but ultimately seem to be driving us either into our own niches or apart, this is definitely something I think that we need to take note of and think about what we can do to remedy that. Another interesting finding at a global level before we dive into the more U.S.-specific view is that the new digital consumers are the most valuable ones, but also the hardest to reach. The heaviest users are digital natives, and they're fully engaged in what the digital world has to offer. They shop online, they use apps to take taxis, they consume media through streaming services. Digital is basically the platform for their lives. But what the survey starts to indicate is that those people who traditionally have leaned most heavily into digital technology products and services are also the ones that are increasingly pulling back and taking actions in terms of installing ad blockers, reducing data sharing, and deactivating social media accounts to take greater control of their digital life in a context of decreasing trust around data and a recognition that digital products and services are having an impact on our lives that might not all be that positive as we have thought. Again, tying back to mental health and polarization of conversations. And we're going to dig into that a little bit further. We do know that when we give people a belief in digital, that they will be more likely to use digital products and services. But as we will see shortly, the opposite is also true. When confidence in digital products and services drops in the companies and brands that provide it, people are pulling back, and that is something that we will have to solve for. We wanted to take a more specific look at the U.S. here, and again, it was interesting that even in the most dynamic digital economy, which is the U.S., human needs are not being met. When it comes to basic needs, despite the fact that we have widespread internet access here in the U.S., Americans are pulling back from digital services due to concerns around data usage and privacy. So the fundamentals for what ultimately enables the full embrace of digital and digital services is now being called into question by the consumers that we're looking to connect with. In terms of psychological needs, we know that digital efforts to positively impact health and wellness have actually had the opposite effect on many consumers in the U.S., where citizens are much more likely to rate digital as having a negative impact on their psychological well-being. So this is actually an area where the U.S. is leading the globe. Other countries don't have this as pronounced, but in the U.S. it is very much becoming an issue. And it's especially manifesting themselves, again, among the digital natives, which means Generation Z and millennials who've grown up with this technology and have fully embraced it. When it comes to self-fulfillment, we are seeing a significant imbalance in digital preparedness, which has left many Americans feeling it is actually their own responsibility to train themselves for a digital future, as other parts of our society, whether it's organizations or schools, no longer seem to be looked towards to provide those kind of skill sets. So people feel that they're on their own, sort of have to pull themselves up by their own digital bootstraps. And again, I think an area for potential opportunities for brands that want to support consumers. And when it comes to societal needs, again, a trust in digital declines, so does optimism about its ability to create a balanced future that works for all. So that's sort of a little bit of a broader overview. The U.S. is ranked the most dynamic digital economy in the world. We have extremely strong digital literacy, with 57% of Americans ranking their digital skill set as being strong or very strong, so almost 2/3. We have wide mobile coverage and adoption. 70% of Americans, or close to 70%, rating their mobile coverage as good or excellent, and there's skill associated with that. And internet access is very pervasive. 65% of Americans rate their internet speed as good or excellent. So again, from an infrastructure point of view, America is both dynamic and inclusive. Trust is going to be the issue, as we will see that going forward. We know that digital has become an integral part. It says a regular part here, but I would actually say an integral part of our lives. Online shopping, managing finances, streaming TV, and consuming media, all of those now rely on digital products and services rather than the analog world. And overall, net, Americans sort of still maintain belief in the positive effects and that the positive effects of digital outweigh the negatives. 67% of Americans agree. That does not mean that Americans are not aware, again, that there are repercussions that ultimately need to be dealt with and are increasingly being considered by American consumers. So while there is an overall net positive view of digital, we see that optimism is waning as Americans experience the darker side of digital. 1 out of 3 Americans at this point believe that personal use of digital has a negative impact on their health and well-being. And what's interesting to consider is that there ultimately is a correlation between psychological needs not being met and higher usage of digital apps and services. So the more intense the use of digital products, the more likely people are to rate themselves as not having their psychological needs being met. You see here that for those for whom the needs are not met, the usage of any kind of app, taxi, finance, music streaming, TV streaming, and health apps is significantly higher than for those who say their mental well-being is actually in balance. It's been a little bit ironic that the advancements in technology to improve wellness actually is driving an increased use of digital technology and services, and a greater amount of time spent online that ultimately might be creating this feedback loop where the heaviest users are feeling that their well-being and psychological needs actually are not being met. We know that there are now more than 1,000 mindfulness apps out there designed to help us disconnect, but ultimately pulling us back into the very thing that we were trying to sort of recover from in the first place. There's also a clear indication that consumers are aware that technology that was meant to bring us closer together has actually driven us further apart. 60% of Americans agree that social media is having a negative impact on political discourse in the country, and that is 15 percentage points higher than the global average. So in the United States very much is on the cutting edge of understanding how digital products and services don't just have the potential to unite, but as much potential to divide, and the need to counter that. Americans are also more aware and more distrustful of how their data is being used. 75% of Americans mistrust, actually I should say 75% of the mistrust that Americans have in technology industry and brands can be attributed to consumers' reservations about how their data is used or in many cases abused. And again, that is significantly higher than the global average, probably to some extent an extension of digital being such a vital part, the U.S. being such an advanced digital economy, and therefore we being on the forefront of recognizing how more and more data that is fueling this digital economy ultimately also puts us at more risk in terms of breaches and privacy. Less than half of Americans trust that the data they share online is secure. Only 2 in 5 Americans trust that businesses are taking the necessary steps to keep their personal data secure. And again, the U.S. slightly lower than the global average, showing that there is a greater trust gap to overcome in the U.S. than in other countries. And only 1 in 3 Americans trust that the government is taking the necessary steps to keep their personal data secure. Again, lower level of trust in the United States than the global average. And again, this really pointing at something that we will talk about a little bit later, which is that as consumers no longer trust brands or government to look out for their best interests, they're starting to take actions and matters into their own hands through a number of behaviors that ultimately will represent a challenge for marketers as consumers are disconnecting and becoming more cautious of how they engage online. As trust in digital is decreasing, so does the optimism about its ability to create a balanced future. What we found is that Americans are far more skeptical of digital's ability to create positive social change. Less than half of Americans are optimistic that digital technology will help solve the world's most pressing challenges. And again, Americans, 40% of Americans, versus 61% of global average. So again, much greater level of skepticism. Americans also worry that in the future, digital will only benefit a select few. 47% of Americans, so almost half, agree that not enough is being done to ensure that digital technology benefits everyone in the society rather than a select few. And again, this probably links back to what we're seeing right now, where a bunch of the Silicon Valley unicorns are going public. There's a small number of people who are lucky enough to be millionaires, and a lot of other people in metropolitan areas like San Francisco being priced out of the market and no longer being able to live in the area where they earn a living. So not a big surprise that this particular attitude is as widespread as it is. Less than 1/3 of Americans believe digital technologies will create career opportunities for them over the next 5 to 10 years. Again, a significantly more critical view of technology in the United States than global, and to some extent understandable. As we're reading about the emergence and increasing deployment of automation in warehousing and manufacturing and in all sectors really, I think there is a need to inspire consumers and help them understand how there is a future for them in this new world, not just for the robots. The extent to which Americans feel prepared for the future varies somewhat based on demographic and life stages. When we looked at subsegments, it turns out that women were actually 23% less likely than the average even, which was low to begin with, to feel that there will be career opportunities for them in the future. The same with older adults, 45 plus, and to some extent the self-employed as well. So there's certainly there's segments within the broader population who I think were even more critical of their future prospects in this ever-changing world than when we just look at the average. With optimism fading, this is what I hinted at earlier, Americans are taking back control of their digital lives. Americans are taking individual responsibility now for their own digital skill set. Only 29% of Americans report having received digital training in the past year, and 37% can't actually remember if they ever received any kind of training in the basics that ultimately set us up for success in a digital economy. Which is why when people were being asked on who should bear the primary responsibility for updating skill sets, and again, given the distrust and skepticism towards corporations and governments, at this point, individuals are taking it upon themselves to upgrade their skill sets. Not that that is something that we want to stand in the way of, but it also points to the opportunity for government and businesses to potentially step into this opportunity where people are not receiving the training they need, and is this a way for brands and governments to connect with consumers around a real need, build trust, and build confidence. This is the really interesting part. Americans are more aware and less willing to share data. As Americans consumers have become more sophisticated and understand how data is fueling the services that they're using, and also increasingly understanding how that data is both used and abused, we find that 72% of Americans have taken some action to scale back their digital activities. 45% are actively reducing the amount of data they share online. 24% have installed ad blockers. 20% are limiting the amount of time they spend online or on mobile with digital services. And 12% have actually gone so far as deleting their social media accounts. All of this, again, is ultimately creating a challenge for marketers who at the best of times, I think, had a hard time connecting with consumers in a meaningful way. And now there's new behavior emerging that I think will make it even more challenging and require, I think, ever more ingenious and creative solutions to connect with consumers, and thinking, and fresh new thinking on what it means for a brand or a marketer to be meaningful at a time when consumers are increasingly cautious. The other thing that's interesting, again, is that the heaviest users of digital products and services are actually the ones at the vanguard in terms of modifying their behavior around digital use. The most digitally savvy Americans are also the ones that are 10% more likely than the average to reduce data online, 20% more likely than the average to have installed ad blockers, 15% more likely to limit the amount of time, and 20% more likely to delete their social media accounts. So the very people that have driven the growth of the digital economy and the adoption of digital products and services are now the ones that are taking a step back and taking a more cautious approach. So the question then is, how can marketers engage with consumers in this new economy where there is less confidence, more distrust, and a more cautious approach towards digital products and services? One of those, we believe, is this notion of prioritizing engagement over reach. As consumers take steps to protect the data and limit their time online, marketers will need to work harder than ever to engage them. And that is probably ultimately coming back to this notion that marketers need to maximize the value of each interaction, that thinking through those kind of things is absolutely critical. And the way that we talk about it here at Dentsu Aegis Network is the notion of experience beyond exposure. How can we add value and create a value exchange, not just by pushing messages out the way we used to do it in the past, but actually connecting with consumers around content, around utilities, around entertainment and real experiences that they value, that are relevant, and make the brand a meaningful partner in a consumer's life. Another way to approach this brave new world of consumer caution and distrust is this notion of shifting from interrupting to intersecting what consumers are interested in. We believe that we live in a world that is increasingly defined by empowered consumers and an opt-in culture, and that ultimately success in that kind of world for a marketer is predicated on a marketer's ability to leverage deep cultural insight to intersect and build on the passions of consumers rather than the old paradigm of interrupting them. A great example is what Smirnoff and Spotify did a while back when they created the Equalizer, which was a way for those two brands to connect to the gender equality movement that ended up transforming both listening habits and proved that an innovative idea built on a shared purpose can drive both growth and good. And what Smirnoff and Spotify did in conjunction with agencies in our network was they realized that while gender equality had manifested in many parts of the world and in many parts of our daily lives, it hadn't really pervaded our music listening habits. When Smirnoff and Spotify looked at the top 10 streams on the platform, it turned out that they were all men. So they wanted to create a utility and a tool that would allow users to become aware of their own biases when they were listening to music and provide a way for users, if they were inclined to do so, to change their behavior and bring more female artists into their consumption pattern, to drive both gender equality as well as greater economic opportunity for female artists who otherwise might not have gotten a chance. So in conjunction with Smirnoff and Spotify, we created an algorithm that allowed consumers to first benchmark what % of their streams were by male versus female artists, and then they could, through an adjustment, this Equalizer tool, shift it towards either more male or more female artists to be brought into their streams. And it was a huge success. It was really embraced well, and I think one of the reasons why it worked, again, it was a brand meaningfully intersecting a broader cultural trends, but also doing it in a way that rather than being preachy about it, they took an approach of empowerment, right? Rather than forcing people into a behavior, they gave people the tools and then left it up to consumers to decide if they wanted to use the tool or not. So I think a very nice example of marketers in a world where consumers are more cautious, delivering real utility and actually paying off this notion of experience beyond exposure. I think this is also a great example to show sort of the responsible use of data, right? Rather than using data that a brand collects about a consumer to use it to sell more stuff to them, in this particular case, Smirnoff and Spotify used usage data from streamers to actually help them understand their behavior better and set it up as a foundation for a behavior change. And I think it's that kind of behavior in terms of brands using data, not just in their own service, but in service of the consumer, that will help start to address some of the issues that our Digital Society Index research identified. Final point is that as we're trying to connect with consumers in more meaningful ways, the notion of segmenting consumers into audiences based on motivations and needs is probably not just a nice to have, but a must have as we go forward. We could leverage a model like the digital needs framework that allows us to understand and respond to consumers with varying degrees of digital literacy. We've actually just used that for a recent client, for retail clients, where we separated the audience into digitally cautious consumers versus their more digitally forward, connected influencers, and then developed very different strategies, both from a content and a media point of view, of how to connect with these people and frame the value of the brand to these two different audiences. The notion of building segments around motivations and needs and not just demographics obviously can be taken into a lot of different directions beyond just digital savviness. It could be applied to lifestyle. It could be applied to interests. The possibilities are endless, but taking a segmentation-based approach will be really key. We also wanted to talk a little bit about how marketers can play a role in balancing the digital economy, given that we've been talking about the fact that there are disconnects. One of the ways that I think issues can be addressed around the distrust in use of data is this notion of being transparent, right? That marketers are able to use more data than ever before to drive relevance and improve service to consumers. But with trust declining, are there ways that brands can be more transparent about how data is being used? And again, not just use it for their own internal purposes in service of the brand, but can the data that they collect actually be put in the service of the actual consumer? And one example that we have here, again, is from Spotify, that uses their insights around consumers' streaming data and turns it into sort of fun little factoids, that end up being incredibly entertaining, right? What are the listening habits by neighborhoods, things along those lines. So that is sort of one example of transparency and making data accessible to consumers rather than just hoarding it for the brand's purpose. Another big issue is this notion of reassurance. We know that with misuse of data being a key driver of distrust, brands need to increase consumer confidence that the data will be protected and handled responsibly. One great example, obviously, here is what Apple did, and I think this was in Vegas, where Apple has built equity in privacy. They've demonstrated, not just talked about, but demonstrated through actions that they take privacy very, very seriously, which then earns them the right to make this places splashy message at CES to kind of reinforce that what happens at Apple stays with Apple. And again, if more brands can sort of follow in those footsteps, where they can both reinsure consumers verbally, but also then demonstrate through real actions of how they're living up to the commitments that they're making to consumers, that will go a long way in restoring trust and confidence. Another notion is the idea of brands responding to the kind of issues that we've identified through the survey. The notion of being aware of the impact that digital has on customers' lives and proactively providing solutions. What you see on the left-hand side, one of those proactive solutions is obviously what Apple has rolled out on their iPhone that now allows users to better monitor how much time they're spending with their digital device and on what content areas to potentially help people more proactively step back and sort of do a digital detox or at least reduce their interaction with the digital device. Another one is the brands that we're listing here. In a world where we're all frantically sort of screening through our news feeds, putting in creative that sort of encourages people to slow down, to breathe, to take a step back and just kind of relax. Another example of responding is what Ben & Jerry does, where they're increasing consumer confidence in digital's ability to create positive change by leveraging digital marketing as a platform for driving social change, for enabling consumers to participate in causes that they feel will drive, will drive society forward, create more equality, and again, move from divisiveness to a greater sense of unity. Finally, there's the notion of truly empowering, the idea that consumers don't currently trust that big business will prepare them for the digital future. That gives brands an opportunity to potentially step into that gap. And by leveling the playing field, brands can create a closer connection to consumers. So on the one hand, again, the notion of empowering consumers through new skills, I would actually take it a step further and say there's also the notion of empowering consumer by helping them understand what data about them is being collected, how it is being used, and giving them better tools to control the data that they share with brands. That's sort of the end of our presentation. I hope you enjoyed our quick little summary of what the Digital Society Index has revealed to us about the changing landscape and consumer mindset when it comes to digital products and services. We're now moving into the Q&A section of this presentation, and we have two questions that have been submitted earlier. One was, what is the impact of data privacy trends on lead generation? Good question, and obviously very relevant. We would say that the evolving privacy regulations will have an impact on the way that brands can collect, store, and utilize personal data, and the kind of data that ultimately has allowed marketers to do and execute more sophisticated marketing programs, whether it's retargeting or sequential messaging or things along those lines. Users will have new rights pertaining to when and where their information has been harvested, how it is being used, and most importantly, if it has been compromised in any kind of way. I think the kind of privacy legislation that we've seen out of Europe, but also currently being contemplated in California, is all pointing in that direction. Our point of view on this, the intent here is really not to stop marketing, right? But it's really to embrace a more customer-centric point of view, I would say, by making it easier for users and consumers to understand when, where, and how their information is being used. And I think at a time when more brands are confessing to customer centricity, I think these kind of privacy regulations should be embraced as a way to actually create more meaningful connections between brands and consumers, because I think otherwise we will continue to go down that spiral of distrust that ultimately will create greater distance between consumers and brands rather than bringing them together. I think while it might impose additional burdens on brands ultimately and potentially require additional investments in terms of technology infrastructure, data infrastructure, and maybe even human resources to handle some of those things, we ultimately see this adding up to stronger customer relationships with brands rather than a weakened ability for brands to connect with consumers. So that would be my answer to question number one. Question number two was, how do you retain trust in the companies using consumer data for good, such as reducing car accidents? And I would say, well, part of the answer to that is what we actually mentioned in some of the case studies. I think the notion of transparency is really important to continue to build consumer trust. And then it's all in how you apply the data. I think if consumers are aware that the data that they share, again, is not just used to exploit them commercially, but it's actually being put to use in service of what consumers value, such as what Ben & Jerry's is doing around social good and using data to bring people into that, or the kind of things that Smirnoff has done with their partners around intersecting with the movement of gender equality and using data to empower people to make different and new decisions. I think that is the way to address what's being asked here in question number two. I guess the shortest way of saying that is, how do you retain trust in companies using consumer data for good, is to move from a model of exploitation to empowerment. I think that's the simplest way of saying, if data is used to empower consumers, there should not be an issue with consumers trusting and connecting to the brands that put them into that position. And with that, I think we have come to the end of this webcast and the end of the questions that were submitted prior to the webcast. Are there any other thoughts?
Thank you, Dirk. We haven't had any other additional questions in yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to close out the webinar with thanking everybody for attending. There's still time to submit questions via the Q&A chat pod, and we will answer them in the coming days. But thank you, Dirk, for presenting today's webinar and giving us that great insight into the 2019 Digital Society Index. And I want to thank all of our attendees today for joining us. As a reminder, you will also get an email within the coming days with a link to the recording of this webinar to revisit the content and share with your colleagues as well. So thank you again for each of you for joining us.
Thank you from my side as well for attending. It's been a pleasure.